So this session is called Enhancing Farm Resilience Through Better Soil Health and the Canadian Organic Growers. And so on this panel, we're going to have Kris Nichols, the Senior Soil Scientist, Food Water Wellness Foundation Consultant, and COG Founder and Principal Scientist at Kris. We're going to have Colin MacDonald, Owner-Operator of Sylvan Lake Farms, Eric Payseur, who's Outreach Manager, ROO and TFRO Program Manager, and COG. And then Allison is, she's an owner and operator of Upland Organics and president of COG.
Thanks so much, everybody, for attending this session. We are super excited to be here today. As Jennifer mentioned, my name is Allison Squires. I'm up here as the president of the Canadian Organic Growers. We're going to moderate this panel highlighting an exciting program which COG has recently implemented in Prairie provinces. This panel will focus on COG's premier regenerative organic oats project, funded by our key partners at Riverside Natural Foods and Nature's Path. We want to take this opportunity to express our sincere thanks to these partners for their continued involvement and support of this project. We have three excellent speakers, and I won't go through their bios again because Jennifer just did, but we'll start today with Eric, who is our COG's Outreach Manager and has been our boots on the ground for this project. It's on the, yeah.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you, everyone. What a pleasure it is to be here, and thanks again to Nature's Path and Riverside Naturals for funding this project. I'm not going to speak very long. I just want to highlight some of the things we've been doing in this program and then turn it over to Dr. Kris Nichols and Colin MacDonald, a farmer in the program. We have many of our farmers here. We started this program last year. This is the first full growing season of the program, and we've been providing and producing resources, training with Kris Nichols, and our goal is to basically spread the knowledge. So any oat growers here who may be interested, please reach out to me to spread the knowledge of organic regenerative practices and implementing them on your farm. And so we anticipate having a wide variety of resources in that regard. One of the things that I am so pleased to have the privilege to be a part of, is, if you see the Soil Your Undies experiment here, but that is really quantifying some of the qualitative soil health experiments that you've heard about earlier today. That are involved in the rock and observing on your farm and in the soil. So having a conversation with Kris has meant that we're able to now think about how can we quantify these and measure them over time and replicate them. So this is one of the most exciting aspects of the project for me, is being able to take the Soil Your Undies, which many of you have probably seen, which is sort of an assessment. You can go online to see farmers with their videos and looking at the microbial activity on those undies, but also doing it with teas and then weighing those and measuring them out so that we can quantify, are we increasing microbial activity with these assessments. So before I turn it over to them, I want to again thank our funders, and anyone who's interested, please come by COG's booth number 66 and talk about how you might be able to be involved in the project. And I would also like to thank for our field days this summer on the ground involvement from grain millers and MGM Seed and Grain for supporting our field days this summer. So thank you very much, and over to Kris.
So yes, our next speaker is Dr. Kris Nichols. I don't think she really needs that much of an introduction. I'm sure many of you in the room know who she is, but she's the absolute leader in the global movement to regenerate soils for healthy crops, healthy people, and healthy communities. And we're very lucky to have her as part of this project. So welcome, Kris.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here, and it was a very exciting year that we had, as Eric mentioned, with the Regenerative Organic Oats program. through COG and with the farmers that we were able to work with. What I get really excited about, I'm a research scientist, so by training I focus on, I'm a soil microbiologist, I focus on what's going on below ground and collecting data, as Eric mentioned. And so I get really excited too about being able to provide that information to farmers and ranchers and seeing how it is that they can be able to do some on-farm testing as well as laboratory testing and get information that can help you to be able to identify some of the tools that you might be able to implement to really enhance what's going on. And so again, in taking a look at this, trying to get a good understanding, trying to get a good understanding of some of these complexities that are happening within our system. I think we need to be focusing on things from a biogeochemical standpoint. Oftentimes when we're focused on soil and soil analysis, we're focused on the chemistry and the results that we get from chemistry. We think about biology and we talk about biology, but really when we're talking especially about these regenerative organic programs and the ability to utilize what's happening in the system, it really is uniting the biogeochemistry of the entire system and focusing more on the system rather than on individual components of things. So we're really trying to, define some management changes, identify what some management changes might be. But all of this is, for me, it's always talking and thinking about options and opportunities. What is it that we can do to be able to help to move things forward? Not staying in the same place, but figuring out what are the things we can put into place. And when you think about things as options and opportunities, and you're doing a risk analysis and an evaluation, that's a lot of what we talk about with the farmers that are part of this program. Have you tried this? What did you see? What are some of the risks that are maybe involved in this? What are some of the payouts? Everything is a trade-off type of an analysis when it is that we're taking a look at this. So we're really working on how, again, we can increase that knowledge with the cohort of farmers that we have as part of this program, but also, again, looking at some of the data and the information that we've got. So Eric had mentioned some of the on-farm testing that we were doing with this cohort of farmers. We did this Soil Your Undies, where again, you can see sort of visually what's happening with the microbial community, but we also utilized not just the underwear, we also looked at a couple of different types of teas because microbes are going to be able to break down different types of carbon compounds. So we're trying to get an idea of being able to address the microbial community and those complexities within the microbial community, what might be happening with the different organisms that you have within that system and how we can be able to measure that and look at it both from a quantitative paradigm as well as a qualitative paradigm. So being able to do these on-farm assessments and doing some of the standard soil testing that we're also doing as making comparisons, looking at the different physical and biogeochemical parameters that may be there. So we did on-farm infiltration testing, looking at water movement and water flow. I also worked with the farmers that are part of the program where we can collect, so I have them sitting there, a couple of different homemade sieves that you can make yourself, and the information will be provided at some point on the COG website, so we can have that information on how you can make your own sieves and what it is that you're going to be able to do that. Because what we're doing is we're passing the soil through those sieves and measuring things like soil aggregates. And the aggregates that are in the soil, they're basically little microbial towns or little microbial habitats. And that's going to affect the microbes that are inside those aggregates. And the environment between those aggregates is where we have the pore space and the openings in our soil that are going to affect water flow and airflow throughout the soil environment. And so if we can get a measurement of that aggregation and the stability of those aggregates, it can give us information about porosity, water infiltration, water holding capacity, aeration, but also nutrient cycling types of information. And so that's something that you can do, again, building some things that are really easy to be able to find the materials and build those things on your own and be able to make those assessments. And I think that one of the things that I find, again, most exciting as a scientist is when I can be out there with farmers and ranchers and see them looking at their soil and digging in the soil. And I'll be out there and, one of the first things I do when I get onto a farm is to put my hands in the ground and feel around and have it run through my fingers and smell it and be able to get that understanding of what's happening in the soil environment. So as we're connecting that in these very complex systems that we're trying to take a look at. And so oftentimes when we're looking at some of the standard soil tests that are out there, when we were doing this assessment with the farmers, we had soil samples that we took, we sent them in for standard soil testing, trying to equate what the plant nutrition needs are with what's happening in the soil. But sometimes you don't get all of the information. It doesn't tell you what's happening. That's chemistry. And chemistry happens the way that chemistry happens, but what we've done is we've started to treat our soils like a benchtop. And we're doing hydroponics outdoors when we're just looking at the chemistry of the soil. But when we're putting it together with the biogeochemistry, we're really getting this greater understanding of the complexities that are there. And so what I wanted to kind of show here is, again, as you look at these different types of measurements that you can make, being able to look, the graphic that's in the middle is basically a look at some of the microbial communities that are out there. And when you look at that graphic, the size of the bars connecting these different groups, so you have the largest sphere there is a bacteria, and what that means is they're the most numerous in the soil. The second largest sphere there are fungi, and then you have smaller spheres that represent some other groups and other organisms that are in the soil. And the size of the bars connecting those two groups illustrate the number of different interactions. And so that very wide bar that connects the fungi and the bacteria, there are more than 9,000 interactions that happen between those organisms. And they happen almost instantaneously. So you're seeing all of this complexity that's happening. When you look at the colors of the bars that are there, the colors of the bars illustrate the darker blue they are, so they range from sort of a clear to more of a green to blue. The darker blue they are, the stronger the relationship is between those groups. And so what I find really interesting with some of these, like with the mites, there's a very strong connection between the mites and the bacteria. And the reason that is because just like us, the mites contain a gut microbiome that's going to be primarily bacteria-based. So the activity of the mites is based on what their gut microbiome is driving them to do. And so you have these very strong relationships that are existing there. And the reason that I wanted to kind of pull this out is the picture that's in the middle. That's from some farmers that are participating in our program. This is actually for flax. And we had soil test data, and we looked at the soil test data, and the flax that just has one boll on it there, the flax that is much smaller, that flax came from soil that actually tested better than the other flax did. And what we found, at least what it indicates to us in taking a greater look at these pictures, is there may be some phosphorus stress involved here in looking at that data. But when you look just at the data for the farm, you would think that the one field should perform better than the other field. But it didn't. And part of the reason is this complexity of all of these different interactions that are occurring here. And that's really, I think, part of what we're learning within this program and being able to talk with the farmers that are participating in this program so that we can get an understanding of, again, I tried this. This was a tool. This worked this way. Why did that work this way? We're always asking these questions of why and how it is that we can continue to be able to move forward so that, as we were talking at lunch, we're going to be able to feed the 8 billion people that are now on this planet, and we're not just going to feed them carbohydrates, but we could actually look at how we might be able to affect feeding them more nutrient-dense food. And so we need to have these connections when we're looking at the entire system at that biogeochemical type of interaction. So I want to kind of turn this back over to Allison and to Colin, one of our other farmers participating in this program.
I always learn something new whenever Kris goes up to the stage. So yes, rounding our session here is actually the actual farmer part of the program, my favorite part. Colin MacDonald is the owner-operator of Sylvan Lake Farms near Henryburg, Saskatchewan. He and his wife Andrea and their children, Graham and Allison, have taken over the family farm and expanded it quite a bit. He keeps busy as a mentor in the Farmers for Climate Solutions cover crop program and as a board member with Sask Organics. In his spare time, he's the international sales manager of Honeybee Manufacturing. And something that I learned by reading up on Colin is that something that I read about him is that he wrote that Colin and Andrew have a great focus on soil and health and are dedicated to leaving the land better for the next generation. And I just loved hearing that. So welcome, Colin.
Thanks, Allison. Good afternoon, everyone. I thought I'd start with a little bit of a background on the farm. So as Allison said, we took over the family farm. What's interesting when we talk about taking over the family farm is it hadn't been farmed in the family for 2 generations. So my great-grandfather bought the farm during the Depression in 1933, was only ever a part-time farmer, and then the next 2 generations didn't farm. I grew up on the farm. My mom inherited it when I was 6 months old, and I guess grew up on the neighbor's equipment. So my interest in farming started and continues in some ways to be in the equipment side of things. As Allison mentioned, I'm the international sales manager for Honeybee, so I spend a lot of time on farms all over the world and working with dealers all over the world in the equipment side, and spent 10 years with Deere before that. I guess when we look at it, you know, I had a push from my mom when we got moved back from a stint down in the U.S. with Deere in 2016. She said, you know, you've always wanted to farm, it's time to go farming, you're close enough to home. And credit to my mom, she wouldn't take no for an answer. I said, Mom, you've got 55 cultivated acres, you can't go grain farming on 55 cultivated acres, and I'm not looking to be a market gardener. And she said, so find some more land. Okay. Then she lined up a few hundred acres of land that a neighbor had, and both of them wanted the land farmed organically. It was all in hay, long-term hay at that point. And so I said, well, that's great, but you know, 300 acres still isn't enough. And she said, so find more land. So I looked around and had a chance to rent some other land that was certifiable from the get-go. It was in long-term hay as well. It was actually, I shouldn't even say long-term hay, it was more long-term neglect. In my naivety, having spent my whole life in and around the industry on, you know, working on farms, working on the custom harvest, working in Australia on farms, I thought, well, I kind of know what I'm doing, I think. I didn't realize that disking willows isn't necessarily best practice. But that's what it was going to take to get that land productive again. So anyway, we started out, and as I've said to people, you know, somebody had said, you know, here's 5,000 acres, go farming, and it was conventionally managed. Well, I just wanted to farm. I would have gone farming. Fortunately, we were given organic land to start with, and come from an organic-minded background. And so we jumped in feet first and bought some equipment and sort of cashed in all the John Deere stock that I'd accumulated in my retirement plan. So hopefully the farming thing works out, because that's where the retirement money is now. Hopefully we'll find a return on it. But anyway, we went in with it thinking that you know, this should be pretty simple. We do a bunch of tillage to control the weeds, and we grow some crops, and we get a premium on, and we done the numbers on the spreadsheet, and this all should work out really nicely, and away we went. And I guess to start with, as it says at the bottom of the slide, we had a really limited understanding of what the effects of tillage were on soil health and some things like that. So fast forward to 6 seasons later, and lots of reading and lots of head scratching and talking to a lot of people. We're trying to figure out where we go with all of this, and fortunately Allison came along last year and said, hey, there's this regenerative organic oat certification project going on. Would you be interested in participating? Dr. Kris Nichols is going to be leading this, and Canadian Organic Growers is the partner body, and it's supported by Riverside and Nature's Path. And I thought, sort of thinking back to what Doug said this morning, we're always looking for ways to fund our little startup farm and get some extra resources and stuff like that. So somebody's going to pay to have Dr. Kris Nichols come and help us do better things on our farm. Well, this seems like a no-brainer. Let's do this. We're on board. So we jumped in, and this is where we started at in terms of what we have been doing. So our farm is heavily rented land. We've managed to buy some over the time we've been farming, and so it comes with a lot of challenges. We get a lot of land offered to us on short-term stuff, where I say the weekend cowboys that don't have land to break tools to break up their old pasture come and say, would you consider farming our land for a couple of years? It's certifiable, and get it back into good shape and take a few crops off, and then seed it back down to hay for us. So we do a lot of that, but it means our land base fluctuates, it comes and goes, and it's hard to get into a really good, strong rotation and do the right things for the land. But in that mix, we sort of hover in that 1,000 to 1,200 cultivated acres range, which is where I'm comfortable. I think I sort of believe that if we had a solid land base of that 1,000 to 1,200 cultivated acres, and we could farm it well in the long term, we can have a very good farming operation that focuses on soil health and continues to increase yield over time. Now, I'm a believer that even within organics, your end goal is yield. Yes, it's soil health and it's all the things that lead to that, but the profitability and the long-term existence of your farm depends on producing a yield that pays the bills. And I happen to have a little bit of an addiction to green and yellow paint, so sometimes the bills are higher than they should be. So we're always trying to push the yield to pay for that green and yellow paint. So typically on the farm, our long-term thinking was we'd go sort of 2/3, 1/3, and that's evolving over time. So 2/3 in crop and a third of it in plow downs and green manures and so on. In what we've done over the years has been typically some degree of spring wheat in it, and we've tended to try to do red fife as often as we can, just because of my interest in the heritage grains. Peas are always part of the mix for obvious reasons, just trying to maintain the levels of nitrogen for subsequent crops. We also do a lot of oats. I like oats because they don't require a lot of nutrients, relatively speaking, and they're very weed competitive. And then some other things in the mix. We tend to do flax. So quite a bit of diversity. We've played with hemp a little bit at times, but we've got quite a diverse mix. And as we headed into it, I sort of had the idea that if we have a diversity of crops, then we have a potential for some crops to do well in any given year, even if others don't do as well, and we're balancing out market pricing risks. So that's where we sort of were at. Why the Regenerative Organic Oats program, or like project, I guess I should call it. As I said, Kris being dangled out there as a resource for the farm was a big draw to the program. But what I'd started to realize is through all the reading that I've done over the past number of years, the videos I've watched, so on, we realized that this wasn't as simple as go out there, do a pile of tillage, control the weeds, seed a crop, harvest it, and be done with it. Within 4 or 5 years, we're already starting to see the effect of all the tillage on the soil and soil health, and also finding that we're not managing to control the weeds as effectively as we'd hoped to. So we felt that participating in a program like this gives us the opportunity to eventually get paid for our best practices, and at the same time really learn how to do things a little bit differently. How can we reduce tillage? How can we maintain good soil health how can we maintain the fertility that we need to produce those bushels I talked about. One of the things we struggle with is a lot of light soils. So I always say we're sort of the new kids on the block. We get the land that nobody else wants to farm. So we farm sloughs and we farm sand and we farm, you know, the stuff that floods and the stuff that dries out when it's dry. And so we look at that and how do we improve that soil? Because I think with the best practices that are out there, we can actually make that soil long-term productive and reliably productive year in, year out, regardless of what the weather is. But it takes a lot more information and resources than what we necessarily have at hand ourselves. So where can we draw on that information and resources? So we had made some shifts over the last few years. I think the pictures illustrate it well. I mean, we have heavy tillage equipment on the top that we tend to be quite reliant on, and then on the bottom a no-till drill. And so as I was looking and saying we need to get away from tillage as much as possible, we made a big push a couple of years ago and said, okay, we're going to go to a no-till drill to try and reduce tillage, because up until that point our drill did a fair bit of soil disturbance as we were seeding. So I thought, okay, well that's one thing I should do. I should reduce tillage. So let's go to a no-till drill and we'll start doing that. So we jumped into that last year, 2021, and had a complete train wreck. The no-till drill didn't suit tilled conditions very well. And we were in a drought year, and so we did too much tillage in the spring. We seeded with a no-till drill that meant it didn't work very well in the soft tilled soil. So we exacerbated the problems of the drought, and then we followed that up last fall with getting panicked and backing off on the tillage and not doing enough tillage last fall, which resulted in all kinds of weed pressure this summer like we'd never seen in the past. So this year we shifted gears a little bit, did some learning as part of the program, learned a lot about in our discussions in the program. I think the one thing that sticks out repeatedly to me is the FIST acronym that Kris uses, talking about tillage, and so frequency of tillage, intensity of tillage, the speed that you're doing the tillage at, the timing of the tillage, and thought a lot about how that fits into our rotation and how do we need to modify our rotation over time to really get that focus on the soil health. Do we need to simplify things? What are we doing? So we've really, in the last 6 or 8 weeks, done a real 90-degree turn, I guess, in what we're doing. I was sitting in the equipment through the fall, thinking a lot about what we do and how we leverage what we're learning as part of this program to really achieve better results. And I said, I think we need to simplify what we're doing, really worry more about the soil health and suitable crops than the diversity of crops and what each one of those crops is worth per bushel and so on. And also try to make it possible to do a better job of the farming. My challenge is I travel 6+ months overseas a year. I come flying in like I did this week. I came in from France on Sunday morning from a farm show over there. I leave again on Saturday to go to Australia for a few weeks for harvest. So in that 5 days I'm home, I go to a conference, I haul some grain, I try to spend some time with my young kids and my wife, and then I'm gone again. And the problem is that happens during the farming season as well. So we've created too much complexity on the farm where we're not managing everything as well as we should. And so can we simplify this and get better results over the long term? So I thought, you know what, we're going to cut this back to 2 crops. We're going to focus on doing a really good job on 2 crops and everything on soil health. We're going to tighten up that rotation, so we're not going 2/3, 1/3 anymore. We're going to go to 50-50 to try and reduce the amount of tillage we're doing, but do it more effectively, time it better, and spend more time focused on those gaps in between on soil health. So as we look at how we proceed with this program and the focus on the regenerative practices, we're shifting to this new mix. So we're going to move to oats, which are part of the program and which have always been a key piece of what we're doing in the last number of years on the farm, into a grazing or hay mix that we'll cut and bale where we don't need, when we have the opportunity, when it makes sense, and where we don't need the nutrients as much. We move into the 40-10 peas, which we have had as a key piece of our rotation. And then the other piece that we started introducing this year was grazed cover crops. So in our 4th year of the rotation, we're going to increase the acres now this way of grazed cover crops, and that's sort of adding that next key component is getting livestock back on the land. And what we've done to do that, because we don't have the time and resources to chase livestock ourselves, is we've partnered with another neighboring farm. They're strictly cattle producers, and so we've developed an agreement where they're grazing the cover crops for us, and that way we get the benefit of the animal impact, the animal integration on the farm, but don't have to chase the cows ourselves, I guess. And it starts leading into that end goal of achieving the regenerative organic certification, and one of those pillars of having livestock in the mix in a way that makes it possible on our farm. I guess I've generally covered this, you know, the FIST acronym, trying to get our land resting for longer periods and really regenerating it in the end. I think Allison might have picked up that quote out of the Western Producer article. It's probably where she talked about our focus on soil health, and that is really what we've learned and is our focus. Is if our kids would like to farm someday, it's been pretty hard to get the farm going again from nothing, and we figure by leaving the soil as healthy as we can, if our kids want to farm, they'll have an opportunity. So back to you, Allison.
Oh, that was really good. Do we have any questions from the audience? Maybe while we're waiting, Kris, I'll throw one at you. I have here, while we have you up here. You kind of mentioned in your talk about how important it is to kind of keep tabs on your soil, and especially the biological component of your soil. If you could give the suggestion to the farmers in the room here, what would be the one test that you would say, if you couldn't do any other test, if you were too strapped for time, if you're going out in your field, what would you pick to do to kind of start assessing the biological health of your soil?
Oddly enough, it's not really a biological test necessarily, but it's an indirect indicator. I think looking at infiltration and water holding capacity can be a good thing to be able to take a look at. So, you know, nothing is in isolation. So when you're looking at infiltration rates, you have to recognize, again, that idea of water holding capacity. So if you have really sandy soils, maybe seeing the water flow through really quickly or things like that. And that's where, along with that, doing testing for soil aggregate and aggregate stability, or doing the soil clod test or slaking test type of a thing, because that's really going to tell you, that's that biological indicator, but it's biology united with geology, physics, and chemistry.
Yeah, that was a really, the slake test has been a valuable tool on our farm as well. Question?
Yeah, I have a question. You had that cut the hay for hay and then plow it down. So the hay's obviously going off the farm as dollars, but you're taking nutrients off there too. What impact do you see that on your soil health? That's question number one. And the 40-10 forage peas, is it a crop or strictly a plow down?
Is this on? Yeah, you can hear me? Okay, good. Good questions. So the idea is probably as much as possible to bale graze that hay right on the farm to try not to export the nutrients. We've had no choice at times but to cut hay and take it off the farm, but the goal is more often than not to try and have those cattle that are grazing our land, hopefully bale graze that in the winter. We're also working on possibly an agreement where we buy into a share of the cattle herd. So that may mean that part of that herd spends its winter grazing the bales on our farm to try and avoid that take out of the nutrients. The 40-10s, we've grown them as plow down, but most of our plow downs now are either clover, alfalfa, or other multi-species. And the 40-10s are primarily a harvested grain crop. They typically go to mums for sprouting.
Doug.
Thank you. Sort of a follow-up, I guess. Maybe you can educate me on that rotation, but at first glance, it looked like you took all the cash crops out, or at least you took what are, in my mind and experience, the most valuable harvested crops and replaced them with what I would assume to be much less valuable crops. So I wonder if you would mind, if it's not too intrusive, going into the economics of how that works versus a more typical, you had wheat and flax and other crops previously that one would think produce greater revenue.
So the slide wasn't as clear as it should have been, but the first year of that 4 years is a cash crop of oats undersown to that mix, that forage mix for the following year. That forage mix the second year can be cut and baled if it makes sense, and then plowed down because it's going to be a high legume mix. The third year is the 40-10 peas as a cash crop. So we do have still 50% cash crop in the mix, and the possibility to have some revenue by putting them through cattle, or if need be, cutting and baling that forage crop. What we probably realized is I think we're not getting the fertility and we're not getting the weed control that we should be at this stage. So we're not knocking it out of the park on the yields of some of those other crops. So we tried looking at it and said, okay, what are the crops that do reliably the best where we are? So we're in a great spot for growing oats. And on a dollar per bushel basis, the oats don't really do as well. But part of our calculation was we can hit a lot more bushels. And much as I love the red fife and would like to keep growing it, if I take the red fife out of the mix, then I can go to the gluten-free certification, which is a $3 to $4 a bushel premium on the oats, which makes the oats much more interesting as a cash crop. And then I think nutrient-wise, we need to keep the peas in the mix. So we've chosen the peas over some of the others. And for a simplification to things, everybody looks at hemp as being a really, really good cash crop, but hemp is very management intensive. So for me, who flies in and out and doesn't have the time to manage something really intensively, a crop like that looks on the surface like a great cash crop can be hard on our nutrient management on the farm and management intensive for growing it. So in the end, it may not be as good a cash crop for us as we think it is.
Yeah, you really have to make it work for your farm in your particular situation, right?
I was just going to sort of add to that on the fact that, again, I sort of had mentioned this on the idea that it's a trade-off analysis, and I think that everything that we do, we need to be thinking about this as a trade-off. So as Colin was saying, part of it is his limitations on time and labor for doing things. And so there's a trade-off that has to go into some of our thinking. And sometimes we're very linear in the way that we look at it. It's how can I get the biggest return, but what we're looking for is really that whole biggest bang for our buck and being able to look at the system as a whole. So, what are all of the trade-offs that you have to put in to having, maybe the highest cash crop value versus what may be some of the costs to be able to produce that, including your time with, your other activities as well as with family and other things like that. Everything has to become all of these different balances.
Yeah, work-life balance matters for farmers too. One last question there, yeah.
This question would be for Kris. In your estimation, what do you, like the whole end game of this organic, our soil health, do you have any empirical data or anything or what would your estimate be on how many years would it take to get a lot of our soils back to the absolute best that they can be?
That's a very interesting question on being able to look at a time period that would be needed to regenerate our soils. And obviously there's going to be a lot of differences as far as where you are and what it is that you can do. I was out at Colin's farm earlier this summer, and he took me out to the beach where he's farming. So there are some things where it may take a little bit more time. It also is that time dependent, is very much dependent too on that balance of things. If you do all of the best things for the health of your soil and to regenerate your soil in the fastest manner, that isn't necessarily going to allow you to be able to stay on your farm or ranch. So, you know, the part of this is to be looking at trying to get that understanding. Just sort of a side note, I flew here this morning from Calgary, and when I was checking in at security, the person asked me, because I had a backpack full of different tools, infiltration rings and a bunch of different tools, and she's like, what is all of this stuff? And I said, you're never going to be able to figure it out. And tea bags and timers and underwear, and it was a nice eclectic mix, let me tell you. And I said, you know, I'm a soil scientist, and she said, well, I just heard that we're running out of soil. And so it is something that I think we're all beginning to start to think about, in the fact that, again, as we have 8 billion people, how are we going to be able to continue to regenerate the soil to feed them? And I think that we have a lot of those options and opportunities that are out there. I think that we can do this in a relatively short period of time. It took between 10 and 30,000 years to make the Canadian prairies. We have, at most, a decade to be able to regenerate them back to that place. And I think that we have the opportunity to be able to do that. So I think, you know, in a good, between 5 and 10 years, I think we could get back a lot to where we were at one point in time. But it's going to take work.
I'm getting some side eye from over here, but I'll ignore them and let you ask your question.
Well, just quickly on that topic, I guess, because I know like 10 or 15 years ago, a lot of guys got out of, you know, went into the organics to get away from inputs. And, you know, as it is, actually, we have a lot of folks over there in their stands that are, you know, selling inputs and stuff. Where do you see that in this whole thing? Is there a place for inputs to help the microbiology come back, or is it better done naturally, or a mixture of both?
You know, I wanted Colin to follow up on this too, obviously, but I guess what I would say is that, again, it took 10 to 30,000 years for the prairies to get to where they were. We don't have that time, and so we're going to have to be looking at how we can intensify that, what was done over that period of time. And so we look at a lot of these different tools that are in place, and that's, you know, integrating the animals back into the system, looking at cover crops, looking at green manure crops, looking at how we're going to, again, I look at, when I think of regenerative agriculture, I think of it as a very intensive, integrated system that we need to be able to have. And that intensity means that we need to be doing a lot more with our systems and pushing our systems a lot harder than we currently are. That doesn't mean that you know, push them to the point of loss. There are ways to be able to look at how we can manage that system. And so, you know, I could spend hours talking about this, and I won't. But I think that as we, you know, again, in talking with the farmers that are participating in this cohort of farmers, we're getting a lot of ideas on how we can improve that intensity. And Colin's putting those things in place.
I think I can add a few quick comments to that. So I think at times there may be a place for some of these inputs in the short term, but I think we can also achieve most, if not all of this, without the inputs. And I think some of the, if we call them amendments, we can create them on farm. You know, we're doing our own, starting to do our own composting and some things like that. And then I think the animal piece is critical. Kris looked at the field that she's named the beach, and there are areas of it that are well below 1% soil organic matter, and you can see the topsoil's on the fence line. You know, and so whoever was farming that over the decades has mined it and left it blowing against the fence line. And Kris said, well, she said the only way I think you can regenerate this soil is livestock. And so we pulled the cash crop plan from that piece of land for next year, and it's getting livestock. So I think it can be done without other inputs, and I'd be very cautious in terms of buying imported amendments, inputs, and so on, because that all has to be accounted for on the bottom line. And the number that matters the most is the bottom line per acre in terms of the viability of your farm over the long term.
That seems like a really great place to end. So thank you guys all very much for attending the panel today, and then a special thank you to you three for your valuable inputs.